6,600 people. Refusing food. Coordinated from inside solitary confinement cells by men who were not supposed to be able to coordinate anything. The mechanics of how that coordination happened across multiple facilities, how word traveled from Pelican Bay to Corcoran to San Quentin to Calipatria, is a story about the limits of isolation as a control mechanism. Legal mail, which prisons are constitutionally required to allow, moved between facilities. Attorneys carried information between clients. Family members communicated through the visiting room and the phone, passing information between incarcerated relatives at different facilities. The network was slow and imperfect, but it existed, and it worked well enough that when July 1st arrived, thousands of people across hundreds of miles were ready to act together. Prison officials had known something was coming. There had been enough signals, enough intercepted communications, enough intelligence gathered through informants, that the CDCR had not been completely blindsided. What they had apparently not anticipated was the scale. The coordination across racial lines. The discipline with which the strikers maintained the refusal. And the degree to which the outside world, journalists, advocacy organizations, state legislators, and the general public would pay attention. Because that attention, when it came, would change everything. The hunger strike had begun as an act of desperation from inside the most isolated corner of the California prison system. It was about to become a national conversation about what solitary confinement actually was, what it did to human beings, and whether a democratic society could continue to look away from it. But first, the CDCR had to decide how to respond. And the response they chose would push the situation from a protest into something that felt, to the men inside those cells, much more like a crisis. The food trays kept going untouched. The days kept passing. And in Sacramento, the phone calls were starting.
If you enjoy real, gripping prison documentaries and true stories, don't forget to like this video, leave a comment, and share it with your friends and family. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss more shocking and exclusive content.
To understand why men who had nothing left decided to stop eating, you first have to understand where they were living. Because Pelican Bay's security housing unit is not simply a harsh prison environment. It was designed, deliberately and precisely, to be something closer to the complete erasure of human experience. Pelican Bay State Prison opened in 1989 in Del Norte County, California, one of the most remote corners of the contiguous United States, roughly an hour from the Oregon border, surrounded by old-growth redwood forest and coastal fog that rarely lifts before noon. The location was not accidental. Distance from population centers meant distance from lawyers, distance from media, distance from family. The California Department of Corrections wanted a facility that would serve as the end of the line, and they built one. The Security Housing Unit, the SHU as everyone calls it, sits at the heart of the facility like a prison within a prison. It is a purpose-built isolation complex, and when it opened, it was considered the most technologically advanced solitary confinement system in the United States. That description sounds almost admiring until you understand what it actually means. It means that the architects had solved the problem of human contact so completely that an inmate could theoretically go weeks without seeing another person's face. Guards communicated through intercoms and food slots. Movement happened in restraints, escorted, one inmate at a time. The design ensured that even accidental human interaction was minimized to near zero. Each cell measured roughly 8 feet by 10 feet. Concrete walls, concrete floor, a steel bunk bolted to the wall with a thin mattress on top. A steel toilet and sink fused into a single unit. A small concrete shelf serving as a desk. A solid steel door with a narrow rectangular food slot near the bottom and a small reinforced glass observation window at eye level. Above, set into the ceiling, a narrow frosted skylight. Not a window because a window would allow a view of the outside world, and the SHU was not designed to offer that. The skylight offered light. Pale, diffused, directionless light that told you nothing about whether it was morning or afternoon, clear or cloudy, what season the world outside was moving through. That was the room. That was the entirety of the room. And men were living in it for 23 hours a day. For the one remaining hour, they were taken to the exercise pen. The pen was a concrete-walled enclosure roughly the size of 2 parking spaces, open at the top to a rectangle of sky covered in chain-link mesh. There was no equipment in the pen. No pull-up bar, no basketball hoop, nothing. Just concrete walls 12 feet high and a patch of sky that changed color with the weather. Inmates exercised alone. They walked in circles. They did push-ups on the concrete. And then they were taken back to their cells. According to Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International documentation gathered over multiple years of investigation, some of the men in Pelican Bay's SHU had been living under these conditions for 5 years. Some for 10. Some for more than 20. The record, documented in court filings related to later litigation, involved men who had spent over 2 decades in near total isolation without ever having their continued placement there meaningfully reviewed by any independent authority. The question of how a person ends up in the SHU is important, because the answer reveals something fundamental about how the system worked. You did not have to commit a violent act inside the prison to be placed in the SHU. Under the CDCR's gang validation policy, which was the primary mechanism driving SHU placements, you could be designated a gang member or gang associate based entirely on evidence that had nothing to do with behavior. A drawing found in your cell. A letter that mentioned someone who was already validated. A book in your possession. Being seen talking to someone on a list. These were called gang indicators, and under the policy in place during this period, a certain number of indicators was sufficient to validate you as a gang member and send you to the SHU indefinitely. Indefinitely. Not for a fixed term. Not with a release date. Indefinitely, meaning until you debriefed, meaning until you sat down with investigators and provided information about gang activity, or until you were deemed no longer a threat, a determination that was reviewed only every few years and almost never resulted in release. Debriefing carried its own consequences inside the prison world, consequences that inmates and their advocates described consistently as potentially life-threatening. So the choice, as many inmates experienced it, was not really a choice at all. It was stay silent and remain in the SHU indefinitely, or talk and face what talking meant. Todd Ashker, who would later become one of the named plaintiffs in the landmark lawsuit challenging SHU conditions, had been in Pelican Bay's SHU for over 2 decades by the time the hunger strikes began. He was not alone in that duration. Court records and advocacy organization documentation identified a cohort of long-term SHU prisoners, men who had been in isolation so long that the outside world had become almost theoretical to them. Children they had known as infants were now adults. Parents had died. Neighborhoods had changed beyond recognition. The world outside the 8x10 concrete room had continued moving, and they had been held completely still inside it. And yet something was happening inside those cells that the architects of the SHU had not fully accounted for. Something that isolation, by its very design, should theoretically have prevented. People were talking to each other. Not freely. Not easily. Through walls tapped in code. Through notes folded small and passed through food slots or carried by the rare inmate who moved between areas. Through words shouted carefully during exercise pen time, calibrated so that they could be heard by the right person and not overheard too clearly by the wrong one. The communication was slow, fragile, and required extraordinary patience. But it was happening. And slowly, over months that stretched into years, something was being built inside the most isolated corner of the American prison system. A plan. What that plan was, who built it, and why it would eventually shake not just Pelican Bay but the entire California correctional system, that is where this story is really going. But before we get there, we need to understand one more thing about the world inside the SHU. Because the physical conditions, the cell, the pen, the frosted skylight, were only part of what these men were living with. The other part was psychological. And according to psychiatrists, researchers, and the testimony of inmates themselves, it may have been the more devastating part of all. Studies conducted by psychiatrist Stuart Gracian, who interviewed inmates in solitary confinement beginning in the 1980s and whose work would later be cited extensively in litigation involving Pelican Bay, documented a consistent and disturbing pattern of psychological deterioration in people held in prolonged isolation. Hypersensitivity to stimuli, perceptual distortions, difficulty with thinking and concentration, emergence of primitive aggressive fantasies, paranoia, a sense of impending dissolution of the self. These were not the responses of men who were already mentally ill before entering isolation. These were responses that the conditions of isolation appeared to produce in people regardless of their prior psychological state. The CDCR disputed some of these findings during this period. But the pattern documented by independent researchers, by court-appointed experts, and eventually acknowledged in legal proceedings, pointed consistently in the same direction. Long-term solitary confinement was not simply punitive. It was, according to a growing body of evidence, a form of psychological harm so severe that the United Nations Special Rapporteur on Torture had described prolonged solitary confinement, defined as isolation lasting more than 15 days, as potentially constituting cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment. Inside Pelican Bay's SHU, men had been in isolation not for 15 days but for 15 years. And in the summer of 2011, some of them had decided they had run out of other options. The food trays were still going untouched, and the world outside was just beginning to pay attention.
Jose Landa-Rodriguez ran his operation through intermediaries, through coded messages, through a chain of command built on fear and obligation. But there was another man inside the Los Angeles federal detention system operating on the same principles, from his own cell, with his own network and with his own body count. His name was Michael Lerma. In Pomona, California, according to his own defense attorney, he had become a mythical figure. A man who had not walked the streets of his hometown since the 1980s. A man who had spent more than 4 decades inside prison walls. And yet, according to federal prosecutors, every warring gang in Pomona, Sir, Happy Town, Ghetto Family, Cherryville, 12th Street, answered to him. Every drug dealer operating on those streets paid him a tax. And when someone failed to pay, people died. Michael Lerma was born in 1956 in Pomona, California. By the time he arrived into the world, Pomona had already begun its long transformation from what it once was. In its earlier decades, Pomona had been known as the Queen of the Citrus Belt, a wealthy enclave of millionaire estates surrounded by groves of lemon and orange trees on the eastern edge of Los Angeles County. By the mid-20th century, the millionaires were gone. The groves had been replaced by affordable tract housing that drew working-class families from across Los Angeles. Aerospace plants provided employment, but the city was steadily becoming something else. Something harder. Michael Lerma grew up inside that hardening city. At a parole hearing in 2009, he described his childhood in his own words. He and his 6 siblings were raised by his mother and grandmother after his father, a heroin dealer, abandoned the family. He was not yet a teenager when he joined the 12th Street Gang, known as Pomona 12th Street 13 or P12. He dropped out of school after the 11th grade. Before he finished high school, he had already been arrested on suspicion of attempted murder, though he was released after 3 days without being charged. What followed that arrest was not a retreat from violence. It was a detour through an institution that briefly showed him something different. Lerma enlisted in the United States Marine Corps. At that same parole hearing, he described his year in the Marines as probably the best year of his life. He spoke about discipline. He spoke about chain of command. He said he had foreseen a promising career. But the career ended before it could begin. He returned to Pomona one night and went out cruising with his younger brother Ruben. According to court records, the two drove into the turf of a rival gang called the Chino Sinners. A 21-year-old man was killed with a shotgun. Both brothers pleaded guilty to second-degree murder. Michael Lerma was 18 years old. At his 2009 parole hearing, speaking in front of the board that would decide his fate, Lerma reflected on what prison had taught him during that first sentence. He did not describe rehabilitation. He described learning how to think and be a convict. Those were his own words. He was released on parole after less than 4 years. He moved to Sacramento with his wife and 2 children. He could not find stable employment. And in Sacramento, according to court records, he reconnected with his father, the same man who had abandoned his family, the same man who was a heroin dealer, and learned the trade. One of Lerma's customers, a man named Randall Craig Kiesner, robbed him at gunpoint of heroin and a power tool. 2 weeks later, Kiesner was sitting in his car outside a 7-Eleven in Sacramento County when gunmen in a Chevrolet Monte Carlo pulled up alongside him and shot him to death. Michael Lerma was convicted of that murder in 1982. He was sentenced to life in prison. He has been incarcerated continuously since 1981. He would never live freely again. But inside the prison system, Michael Lerma did not diminish. He grew. Over the decades that followed his 1982 conviction, Lerma moved through the California prison system and built the kind of reputation that, inside those walls, translates directly into power. According to federal prosecutors and law enforcement records, California prison officials validated Lerma as a full member of the Mexican Mafia in 1995. Lerma would deny this to the parole board. He told board members repeatedly that he had never been a member of any prison gang. But the federal indictment filed against him in 2018 described a different reality. It described a man who, since at least 2012, had been taxing drug dealers across the Pomona area under the threat of assault or death. It described a man whose power, according to the assistant United States attorney who prosecuted him, transcended rivalries between gangs that were otherwise killing each other on the streets. It described a man who had the power, in the prosecutor's words delivered in open court during closing arguments, to decide life or death or just plain old pain. The structure Lerma built outside prison mirrored the structure Landa-Rodriguez had built inside Los Angeles County Jail. But it had a different geography. Lerma controlled the streets of Pomona from prison through a network of high-level associates who carried titles drawn directly from the organizational language of the Mexican Mafia. At the top of his external operation were women known as señoras, trusted female associates who wielded genuine authority on the street in his name. One of those señoras was Cheryl Perez Castaneda, 62 years old at the time of her conviction, a Pomona woman who federal prosecutors described as a high-level associate who held real power. From 2012 to 2016, according to court documents, Perez Castaneda collected extortionate taxes from Pomona drug dealers and funneled the proceeds back to Lerma inside prison. She gave orders to others in the enterprise. She managed disputes. And when she decided someone needed to be removed, she used her position to make it happen. In July 2013, Perez Castaneda used her authority as Lerma's voice on the street to solicit the murder of a Los Angeles County Jail inmate, a man who had been targeted in retaliation for the shooting of her son. When she was informed that the man had been stabbed but had survived, she sought and obtained approval from a Mexican Mafia member to have the victim placed on the gang's green light list. According to court records, Perez Castaneda later laughed about the shooting on a recorded telephone call. She was sentenced to 12 years in federal prison. Below the senoras were secretaries, associates who handled the flow of information and money between Lerma and his network. One of those secretaries was Kelly Deshannon, a La Verne woman convicted in 2023 of RICO conspiracy after a federal jury found she had facilitated an armed robbery on Lerma's behalf, distributed narcotics, and helped run extortion operations tied to his cell of the Mexican Mafia. She was sentenced to 85 months in federal prison. The system was layered, redundant, and designed to keep Lerma insulated. The senoras handled the streets. The secretaries handled the communications. The shot callers handled enforcement inside the facilities. And Lerma, sitting in a prison cell, collected the proceeds. When federal authorities transferred Lerma from Calipatria State Prison in Imperial County to the Metropolitan Detention Center in downtown Los Angeles in 2018 as part of a strategy to disrupt his operations, something unexpected happened. The disruption failed. According to the expanded indictment filed in 2021, Lerma simply adapted. He extended his taxation system into the Metropolitan Detention Center itself. He established control over drug trafficking within the federal facility. He exacted a thirds tax on all narcotics smuggled into and sold within the MDC, the same model that had governed operations inside the Los Angeles County jail system. And he identified 3 enforcers already housed at the MDC, Carlos Gonzalez known as Popeye, Jose Valencia Gonzalez known as Swifty, and Juan Sanchez known as Squeaks, who would carry out his orders directly. On June 28, 2020, those 3 men entered the cell of a federal inmate identified in court documents only as SB. His full name was Steve Bencom. He was 39 years old. He had been sentenced 5 months earlier to 10 years in federal prison for trafficking methamphetamine. According to the indictment and coroner records, Bencom was stabbed and strangled inside his cell. He was pronounced dead the following day, June 29, 2020. The reason for his murder, according to federal prosecutors, was a drug debt. Bencom had failed to repay money owed to Lerma's cell of the Mexican Mafia. In the economy that governed life inside those walls, a failure to pay was not a financial dispute. It was a challenge to authority. And challenges to the authority of Michael Lerma did not go unanswered. After a 20-day trial in downtown Los Angeles, a federal jury found Michael Lerma, Carlos Gonzalez, Jose Valencia Gonzalez, and Juan Sanchez guilty on all major counts. Lerma was convicted of conspiracy to violate the RICO Act, violent crimes in aid of racketeering, first-degree murder within the special maritime and territorial jurisdiction of the United States, and conspiracy to distribute controlled substances. In March 2026, Michael Lerma was sentenced to life in federal prison. He was 68 years old at sentencing. He had been incarcerated continuously since 1981. He had spent 43 years inside the prison system of the United States. And according to prosecutors, he had used every single one of those years to build, expand, and enforce a criminal empire whose reach extended from a federal detention cell in downtown Los Angeles to the streets of a city he had not walked freely since Ronald Reagan was president. His attorney had called him a mythical figure. Federal prosecutors called him something else. They called him the operational head of a cell that murdered a man over a drug debt in a federal facility that was supposed to be the most controlled and monitored detention environment in Los Angeles County. The Mexican Mafia had not been defeated when Landa-Rodriguez was removed. It had simply found another man to run the operation. And that man had been there all along. But while the Mexican Mafia and its Sureño network consolidated their grip on the Latino inmate population inside Los Angeles County Jail, a war that had been burning on the streets of Southern California since 1972 was also being fought out inside those same walls. It was older than the Mexican Mafia's hold on LACJ. It had claimed more lives than any single federal prosecution could count. And it had begun with 2 teenagers in South Central Los Angeles who had a vision, and whose vision tore an entire community in two. The 2 men you have just heard about, Jose Landa-Rodriguez and Michael Lerma, both built their power inside the same system. They both ran their operations through intermediaries. They both taxed, extorted, and ordered violence from behind locked doors. But they were not the architects of the war that had been tearing Los Angeles County apart since before either of them rose to power. That war had deeper roots. And it began not with a cartel negotiation or a federal indictment. It began with a 6-year-old boy who stepped off a Greyhound bus in South Central Los Angeles and found himself alone on a street that he would later describe as a shiny red apple rotting away at the core. Stanley Tookie Williams III was born on December 29, 1953, in New Orleans, Louisiana. His mother was 17 years old when he was born. His father abandoned the family before Williams had reached his first birthday. In 1959, when Williams was 5 years old, his mother packed what they had and bought 2 tickets on a Greyhound bus heading west. They were looking for something better. They found South Central Los Angeles. According to Williams' own memoir, Blue Rage, Black Redemption, published in 2004, the neighborhood looked promising at first glance. It looked clean. It looked ordered. But beneath the surface, he wrote, it was already in decay. Williams' mother worked multiple jobs to keep them housed and fed. That meant Williams was alone on the streets for long stretches of time, starting from an age when most children are learning to read. He described himself as a latchkey kid. He described the street as more interesting than being at home. And on that street, as the new arrival, the boy from New Orleans with no father and no crew and no history in the neighborhood, he quickly learned what the rules were. You were either prey or predator. Those were his words, recorded in court filings and in his own writings. He chose predator. By age 12, Williams was carrying a switchblade. By his mid-teens, he had been expelled from school, had cycled through juvenile detention, and had built a reputation across South Central's west side as someone who could fight and who did not back down. He barely attended high school. He spent his time instead on the streets, in vacant lots, in the orbit of older men whose lives were defined by toughness, by territory, and by the enforcement of both through violence. In the late 1960s, South Central Los Angeles was undergoing a transformation. The older gang structures that had dominated the neighborhood were dissolving. Many of their leaders had moved toward the Black Power movement, toward the Black Panther Party, toward the idea that political organization rather than street violence was the answer. As those structures dissolved, a vacuum opened. Younger men and boys filled it. Williams was one of them. In 1969, he encountered a young man named Raymond Washington on the streets of South Central. Washington was building something. He had a vision of a neighborhood alliance, a network of young men who would protect their community from the gangs that preyed on it. The 2 teenagers joined forces. What they built together would change Los Angeles forever. They called it the Crips. The origin of the name has never been definitively established. Some accounts suggest it evolved from the word Crips, a reference to the young age of the founding members, and was gradually corrupted through mispronunciation into Crips. Others suggest it referenced the cane some members carried as a display of toughness, leading people in the neighborhood to call them cripples. What is not disputed is what the Crips became. What started as an alliance of approximately 30 young men on the west side of South Central grew with extraordinary speed. Other neighborhood groups joined. Then other neighborhoods joined. Then neighborhoods across the city joined. By 1978, according to law enforcement records, there were 45 Crip sets in Los Angeles County alone, with a combined membership estimated at 20,000. The original mission, protecting the community, had been consumed long before that point. The Crips were no longer a neighborhood watch. They were a criminal organization. And they were a brutal one. Williams himself acknowledged in his memoir that the Crips had become exactly the kind of predatory gang he had originally claimed to oppose. But by the time he acknowledged that the machinery he had helped build was far beyond any individual's control, the expansion of the Crips generated resistance. Other neighborhoods, other gangs, other young men who refused to join or submit, began to organize against them. In 1972, a group of gangs centered on Piru Street in Compton, originally a Crip set that had broken with the alliance after internal violence, called a meeting. The purpose of that meeting was survival. Several gangs that had been victimized by the Crips gathered together and made a decision. They would build their own federation. They would wear red, not blue. And they would call themselves the Bloods. The war that followed that decision has lasted more than 50 years. It has spread from the streets of South Central and Compton to cities in 37 states and beyond the borders of the United States. It has claimed thousands of lives, many of them not gang members at all, but civilians, bystanders, children caught in the crossfire of a conflict they had no part in creating. And it has filled the cells of Los Angeles County Jail with both sides of that war, housing them in proximity to each other, in a facility with its own power structures, its own economies, and its own lethal hierarchy. Stanley Williams spent the 1970s at the center of all of it. By 1974, Raymond Washington had been pushed to the margins. Williams was the dominant figure in the Crips. He was physically imposing, described by those who encountered him as massively built, the product of years of obsessive weight training that had made him one of the most physically intimidating men on the streets of Los Angeles. He was also volatile. In 1976, he was shot in a drive-by attack by Bloods at the porch of his house in Compton. The injuries were severe. He lost his ability to walk for 2 years. During that period, he developed what his own accounts describe as a substance abuse problem, smoking PCP, supporting the habit through intimidation and robbery. By 1979, the Crips were in a different kind of crisis. Raymond Washington was shot and killed in August of that year. His death triggered internal warfare between Crip sets, as factions that had aligned with Washington turned against factions aligned with other leaders. The organization that Williams had co-founded was fracturing, and Williams himself was spiraling. On February 28, 1979, according to prosecutors, Williams and 3 associates smoked PCP-laced cigarettes and drove to an industrial area east of Los Angeles looking for somewhere to rob. They found a convenience store on the outskirts of the city. The store's only employee that night was a 26-year-old man named Albert Owens. According to testimony presented at trial, Williams took Owens to a back room at gunpoint. He shot out the security monitor. Then he shot Albert Owens twice in the back of the head. Owens died immediately. The robbery netted Williams and his associates approximately $120. Williams maintained until the day of his death that he did not kill Albert Owens. But the physical evidence at trial told a different story. Ballistic analysis tied the bullets recovered from the crime scene to a shotgun connected to Williams. Fellow Crips members testified against him. 11 days after the murder of Albert Owens, on March 11, 1979, Williams was alone. According to prosecutors, he broke into the office of the Brookhaven Motel in South Central Los Angeles. Inside the motel, he encountered 3 members of a family from Taiwan who owned and operated the business. Yanai Yang was 76 years old. His wife, Tsai Sha Yang, was 63. Their daughter, Yichin Lin, was 43 years old and visiting her parents. All 3 were shot and killed. The motive, according to prosecutors, was robbery. The robbery yielded Williams approximately $100. 4 people were dead. The investigation that followed would take more than 2 years. In 1981, Stanley Tookie Williams was tried in Los Angeles Superior Court on all 4 murders. He was convicted on every count. He was convicted of 2 counts of robbery, and he was sentenced to death. On April 20, 1981, Williams was transported to San Quentin State Prison and placed on California's death row. He was 27 years old. He would spend the next 24 years inside those walls. The early years on death row were not a period of reflection for Williams. They were a period of continued violence. According to prison records and his own subsequent admissions, Williams was incorrigible from the moment he arrived at San Quentin. He assaulted guards. He assaulted other inmates. On at least one documented occasion, according to prison officials, he ordered fellow Crips members inside the facility to attack another inmate. The man was stabbed and survived. For these incidents and others, Williams was placed in solitary confinement in 1987. He would spend 6.5 years there. 23 hours a day alone in a cell. No contact with other inmates. Minimal contact with staff. Nothing but walls, time, and his own thoughts. It was inside that solitary cell, Williams later said in a recorded interview with Democracy Now!, that something began to shift. He described it not as a single moment of revelation but as a slow and grinding process. He said he began to read. He began to educate himself. He began to examine what he had built and what it had cost. He described himself as that messed up, that lost, that mental-sided, his own word, meaning his mind had been colonized by a set of values that were destroying him and everyone around him. He was released from solitary confinement in 1994. What followed was one of the most contested and complicated second acts in the history of American criminal justice. Williams began writing. In 1996, working with co-author Barbara Kottman Becknell, he published the first of what would become a series of 8 children's books, all aimed at steering young people away from gang membership. In 1997, he wrote a public apology for his role in co-founding the Crips. In 2001, he was nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize by a member of the Swiss Parliament. He would be nominated 6 times in total. In 2004, he authored the Tookie Protocol for Peace, a documented agreement designed to end the violence between the Crips and the Bloods, a conflict that had by then claimed an estimated 20,000 lives over 3 decades. President George W. Bush sent Williams a letter commending him for that effort. But the courts and the state of California were not moved. His appeals were denied at every level. His conviction was upheld repeatedly. And California Governor Arnold Schwarzenegger, after a closed-door clemency hearing on December 8, 2005, denied Williams' petition. In his written decision, Schwarzenegger cited the forensic evidence connecting Williams to the murders. He cited Williams' continued refusal to assist authorities in investigations of ongoing Crips gang crimes. And he cited the dedication page of Williams' own book, Life in Prison, a dedication that included the name of George Jackson, the black Guerrilla family founder who had died in a San Quentin escape attempt in 1971. Schwarzenegger stated that these factors were strong indications that Williams had not genuinely reformed. On December 13, 2005, at 12:35 in the morning, Stanley Tookie Williams was executed by lethal injection at San Quentin State Prison. He was 51 years old. According to witness accounts reported by journalists present at the execution, The process took 36 minutes and 15 seconds from the moment Williams walked into the chamber alive to the moment the warden declared him dead. There were no last words. According to the California Department of Corrections, Williams did not order a last meal. The man who had co-founded the Crips, who had set in motion a war that would consume generations of young men in Los Angeles and across the country, who had spent 6.5 years in solitary confinement and emerged to write children's books and broker a gang peace agreement and be nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize 6 times, died on a gurney in a room at San Quentin, surrounded by witnesses he had not invited, in the early hours of a December morning. His body drew 2,000 mourners when it was laid out for viewing. His funeral filled a 1,500-seat church in Los Angeles. His ashes, at his request, were scattered into a lake in Soweto, South Africa. The Crips did not dissolve when Williams died. The Bloods did not dissolve. The war he had set in motion in 1969 continued inside every jail and prison in Southern California, including Los Angeles County Jail, where both sides had been locked in proximity for decades and where the violence that had begun on those streets had found a permanent second home behind concrete walls and steel doors. What you need to understand now is that while that war between the Crips and the Bloods was burning, another organization was operating inside the same facility with an entirely different ideology, an entirely different structure, and an entirely different and documented history of violence. An organization that was not born on the streets at all. An organization born specifically inside the prison system. An organization whose founder was killed inside a California prison in 1971, and whose death did not end the movement. It ignited it. The war between the Crips and the Bloods was a war between two organizations born on the streets of Los Angeles. It was a war over territory, money, and survival. But running alongside it, inside the same walls of Los Angeles County Jail, was something different. Something older in ideology. Something that had not begun as a street gang at all. Something that had been conceived not from a desire to control a neighborhood, but from a desire to dismantle an entire system. The organization was the Black Guerrilla family. And to understand it, to truly understand what it became and why it still operates inside California's jail and prison system today, you have to understand the man who created it. His name was George Lester Jackson. And his story begins not in Los Angeles and not in a prison cell. It begins on the west side of Chicago, Illinois, on September 23, 1941. George Jackson was the second of 5 children born to Robert Lester Jackson and Georgia B. Jackson, a working-class family living in one of the oldest sections of Chicago's West Side. In a letter written from prison in June 1970, Jackson described the neighborhood with precision. The L train that passed a few yards from the front windows of their home, the mix of ghetto residential blocks and factory buildings, the texture of a community that was alive and poor and shaped by forces far beyond any single family's control. His father was a postal worker. His mother raised 5 children alongside a husband who worked long hours for modest wages. By all accounts of those who knew the family, the Jacksons provided George and his siblings with a stable and loving home. During summers, Jackson visited his grandmother and aunt in the rural areas of southern Illinois, where he developed an independent streak and learned to use firearms and hunt. But the stability of his home was surrounded by instability everywhere else. Chicago's West Side in the 1940s and 1950s was being reshaped by the Second Great Migration. Millions of Black Americans moving north from the Jim Crow South in search of better lives and finding instead a different version of the same inequality, expressed through segregated housing, underfunded schools, and a policing apparatus that treated Black youth as inherently criminal. In 1956, Jackson's father made a decision. He transferred his postal job to Los Angeles and moved the family west, trying to get his son out of the orbit of the bad influences that were beginning to accumulate around him in Chicago. It did not work. In Los Angeles, George Jackson joined a street gang called the Capones. At 15 years old, he was arrested for stealing a motorcycle. He was convicted of assault and burglary and sent to the California Youth Authority Corrections Facility in Paso Robles. He was released. He was arrested again, suspected in a string of robberies. And on February 1, 1961, at the age of 18, George Jackson stood before a California court and entered a guilty plea to armed robbery. He had stolen $71 from a gas station. He had inadequate legal representation. He had a juvenile record. And the court gave him an indeterminate sentence, 1 year to life in California State Prison, with his actual release date to be determined not by the judge but by the parole board. George Jackson would never leave prison alive. He spent his first years at Soledad Prison in San Quentin, cycling between the two, cycling in and out of solitary confinement as his disciplinary record accumulated. Prison officials characterized him early on as egocentric, antisocial, and resistant to authority. They were not wrong about the resistance. But what they failed to document, what the disciplinary reports could not capture, was the transformation happening inside the man they were writing up. In 1962, Jackson was transferred to San Quentin, where he encountered a fellow inmate named W.L. Nolan. Nolan was older, politically sharpened, and deeply read in the radical literature that was circulating through California's prisons in the early 1960s. He introduced Jackson to Marx, to Lenin, to Trotsky, to Mao Zedong, to Franz Fanon. Jackson absorbed all of it. In a letter that would later become famous, he wrote that he had met Marx, Lenin, Trotsky, Engels, and Mao when he entered prison, and that they had redeemed him. He spent his early years in solitary reading everything he could access. He taught himself political economy. He taught himself history. He taught himself theory. And he began to reframe his own life. His arrests, his conviction, his imprisonment, not as the result of individual bad choices but as the predictable product of a system designed to criminalize and incarcerate black men. By 1966, Jackson and Nolan, along with a fellow inmate named George Big Jake Lewis, had formed a study group at San Quentin that evolved into something more structured. That structure became the Black Guerrilla family. Its founding ideology was Marxist-Leninist. Its stated mission was the overthrow of the United States government and the liberation of black people from what it described as the machinery of capitalist oppression. Its organizational structure was paramilitary, a hierarchy with Jackson at the top and a set of written rules, a code of ethics, and an oath of allegiance binding every member. Jackson described the BGF's goal not merely as survival inside prison but as the transformation of the criminal mentality into a revolutionary mentality, converting men who had been imprisoned for crimes of poverty and desperation into politically conscious soldiers. The BGF grew. It recruited from the black inmates of San Quentin and Soledad. It spread through correspondence, through the passing of documents between cells, through the slow and patient work of political education conducted under the noses of a prison administration that was increasingly alarmed by what it was watching develop. In January 1969, Jackson and Nolan were transferred from San Quentin back to Soledad Prison in Monterey County. On January 13, 1970, a corrections officer named Opie G. Miller fired into a yard fight between black and white inmates from his position in the guard tower. He killed W.L. Nolan. He killed two other black prisoners, Cleveland Edwards and Alvin Miller. A fourth shot wounded a white inmate. A Monterey County grand jury convened and ruled the shootings justifiable homicide. Not a single black inmate was permitted to testify. The ruling was broadcast over the prison radio. 30 minutes after the inmates at Soledad heard it, a white corrections officer named John V. Mills was found beaten and thrown from a third-floor tier to the television room below. He died from his injuries. George Jackson, Fleta Drungo, and John Clutchette were charged with the murder. The evidence against them was thin. The motive attributed to them by the state was retaliation for the killing of Nolan and the two others. If convicted, all three faced execution in California's gas chamber. They became known internationally as the Soledad Brothers. Their case drew the attention of Angela Davis, then a philosophy professor at UCLA, who became co-chairperson of their defense committee. It drew the attention of writers, intellectuals, and activists across the United States and Europe. And it drew the attention of Jackson's 17-year-old brother, Jonathan. On August 7, 1970, Jonathan Jackson walked into the Marin County Civic Center courthouse in San Rafael carrying a concealed weapon. He distributed guns to 3 San Quentin prisoners who were present at a separate hearing, took 5 hostages including Superior Court Judge Harold Haley, the deputy district attorney, and 3 jurors, and attempted to drive them away in a van, demanding the release of the Soledad brothers. Police opened fire on the van as it attempted to leave the courthouse parking lot. Jonathan Jackson was killed. William Christmas was killed. James McLean was killed. Judge Harold Haley was killed, shot through the neck by a sawed-off shotgun that had been taped to his face. Jonathan Jackson was 17 years old. From his cell in Soledad, George Jackson dedicated his book of prison letters, a book that was about to make him internationally famous, to his dead brother. Soledad Brother, The Prison Letters of George Jackson was published in the fall of 1970. It became a bestseller. More than 400,000 copies were sold. It was translated and read across Europe. It was embraced by radical intellectuals and prison rights activists worldwide. It was also, according to the California Department of Corrections, contraband. For decades, any material referencing George Jackson was banned inside California prisons. So powerful and so threatening did the institution find the ideas of the man it was still holding inside its walls. The Soledad brothers were transferred to San Quentin in the summer of 1971 as their trial approached. On August 21, 1971, 3 days before the trial was scheduled to begin, an uprising erupted at San Quentin. The official account states that Jackson had a 9mm pistol smuggled to him by his attorney, hidden inside an afro wig. According to that account, as Jackson walked back from a meeting with his lawyer, a guard noticed something protruding from his hair. Jackson pulled the gun, released an entire floor of prisoners from the maximum security wing, and announced, in the words of witnesses quoted in official reports, "This is it, gentlemen, the dragon has come." What followed left 6 people dead. 3 guards were killed. 2 prisoners suspected of being informants were killed in Jackson's cell. And George Jackson was shot dead in the prison yard by a tower guard. He was 29 years old. He was a month short of his 30th birthday. He never went to trial. He never left prison. The circumstances of his death have been disputed for more than 50 years. His mother told Oakland Television the night after his death that guards had starved him and denied him clean water for 3 days before the shooting. James Baldwin, the novelist, wrote that no black person would ever believe George Jackson died the way the authorities described. 8,000 people attended his funeral at St. Augustine's Episcopal Church in Oakland on August 28, 1971. Less than 3 weeks later, on September 9, 1971, inmates at Attica State Prison in New York launched what would become the most famous prison uprising in American history. Multiple accounts cite Jackson's death as one of the catalysts. In the years that followed, the Black Guerrilla family did not dissolve without its founder. It expanded. It recruited from the armies of Crips and Bloods that were being imprisoned in the 1980s as the crack cocaine epidemic filled California's jails and prisons with a new generation of young black men. It maintained both a revolutionary faction committed to Jackson's original ideology and a criminal faction focused on drug trafficking, extortion, and the control of prison economies. Its symbols, the letters BGF, the number 276, the dragon coiled around a prison tower, became identifiers that law enforcement learned to document and track. And its presence inside Los Angeles County Jail became documented reality, another layer of the complex power structure that governed life inside those walls, operating alongside the Mexican Mafia, the Sureños, the Bloods, and the Crips in a permanent and lethal negotiation over space, money, and authority. George Jackson had described prison as the closest thing to being dead that a person was likely to experience in life. He had also described it as the place where the most dedicated and most dangerous men were made. Both statements proved true. The organization he built from a cell in San Quentin on the foundation of his own rage and his own reading is still operational today. The man himself was buried at Bethel Cemetery in Mount Vernon, Illinois, a long way from the prison towers of San Quentin, and a long way from the Los Angeles streets where his journey had begun. That was the story of George Jackson. But inside the same California prison system, a different kind of organization was consolidating its own power at precisely the same moment Jackson was building the BGF. An organization that was not driven by revolutionary politics. An organization that was not motivated by racial liberation or the dismantling of capitalism. An organization that was motivated by one thing only, the ruthless acquisition and defense of criminal power, using violence as its primary and preferred instrument. Its members called themselves the Brand. The rest of the world knew them as the Aryan Brotherhood. And the man who would anchor their story in this documentary was convicted just last year. Not in 1971, not in 1984, but in 2025, proving that the organization George Jackson had spent his life opposing was still active, still deadly, and still directing murders from inside a California prison cell. His name was John Stinson, and he was 70 years old when a federal jury found him guilty. George Jackson built his organization on ideology. He built it on Marx and Lenin and Fanon and the belief that the prison system was a weapon, and that the men inside it could become weapons against the system that held them. The Aryan Brotherhood was built on something entirely different. It was built on survival. And then, very quickly, it was built on money. In 1964, the same year George Jackson was entering the California prison system and beginning to read, a group of Irish-American bikers at San Quentin State Prison made a decision. The prisons were desegregating. Black inmates were organizing. White inmates who had no structure and no organized protection were being targeted. The bikers at San Quentin decided that was going to stop. They had been known as the Diamond Tooth Gang, then the Bluebirds. And in 1964, as they merged with other white inmate factions at San Quentin and formalized their alliance, they took the name that would make them notorious for the next 6 decades. The Aryan Brotherhood, known inside the walls as the Brand. The Southern Poverty Law Center would later describe them as the nation's oldest major white supremacist prison gang and a national crime syndicate. The Anti-Defamation League called them the oldest and most notorious racist prison gang in the United States. But as both organizations noted, and as federal prosecutors confirmed across decades of prosecution, the white supremacist ideology was almost secondary. The primary motivation was money, drug trafficking, extortion, murder for hire, contract killing inside the walls and on the streets outside them. An oath of absolute loyalty, enforced through violence, and a system of membership built on a principle that every member understood from the moment they joined. Blood in, blood out. You entered through violence. You left through death. In the decades that followed 1964, the Brand expanded from a San Quentin faction into an organization that penetrated every major federal and state prison in the country. By the time federal prosecutors built their largest case against the gang's leadership in 2002, the Aryan Brotherhood represented less than 0.1% of the total United States prison population. But according to FBI data cited in federal prosecutions, they were responsible for 18% of all prison murders. 0.1% of the inmates, 18% of the murders. That single ratio, documented and entered into federal court records, tells you everything you need to know about what the Aryan Brotherhood actually is. Stripped of ideology and mythology and the symbols tattooed across their skin, it is a killing machine. And for decades, one of the men who kept that machine running was a California state prisoner who had been behind bars since 1981. His name was John Stinson. Inside the gang in the early 2000s they called him Youngster. He was 70 years old when a federal jury convicted him in Fresno, California in February 2025. He had been imprisoned continuously since 1981, serving a sentence of life without parole for the murder of a Long Beach drug dealer committed in 1979. That was the crime that first put him inside. He never left. And during all of those decades, through the 1980s, the 1990s, the 2000s, the 2010s, and into the 2020s, John Stinson did not diminish inside the California prison system. He rose. Court documents from the 2025 federal RICO prosecution describe Stinson as a high-ranking leader of the Aryan Brotherhood with substantial authority over the enterprise. That authority included resolving disputes among members. It included approving the murder of current or former members. It included sponsoring multiple individuals for full gang membership, a process that, inside the brand, meant vouching for a new entrant's willingness and capability to commit violence on the organization's behalf. Federal investigators built their case against Stinson and his co-defendants, Francis Clement and Kenneth Johnson, over years of surveillance. They obtained court-authorized wiretaps on the smuggled cell phones that all three men were using from inside California state prison cells. The jury heard those recordings at trial. They heard Stinson discussing gang matters. They heard him addressing membership decisions. They heard him engaging in internal disputes over the direction and operations of the organization. And they heard evidence that he received a cut of the drug sales his associates were generating, inside the prison walls and on the streets of Los Angeles County simultaneously. His co-defendants operated with the same tools and the same ruthlessness. Between 2020 and 2022, according to the jury's verdict, Francis Clement and Kenneth Johnson ordered 7 murders. 7 people killed on the streets of Los Angeles County. Because men sitting in California state prison cells had decided, using smuggled cell phones, that those 7 people needed to die. The victims, according to testimony, had either violated gang rules or failed to pay money owed to the organization. Their names are entered into the permanent federal court record of the Eastern District of California. Alan Roshansky, Ruslan Megomedgadzeev, Michael Brizendine, James Yeagle, Ronnie Ennis, and 2 additional victims killed in the commission of those ordered murders. 7 people. 7 names on a federal document. 7 lives ended because of orders issued through contraband cell phones from inside prison cells. After a 4-week trial before United States District Judge Jennifer Thurston in Fresno, the jury deliberated for 3 days. On February 14, 2025, they returned their verdict. Guilty on all major counts. Francis Clement was sentenced to life in federal prison. There is no parole in the federal system. Kenneth Johnson was sentenced to life in federal prison. And John Stinson, already serving a life without parole sentence in California State Prison for the 1979 murder, was sentenced to an additional 20 years in federal custody. He was 70 years old at sentencing. He had been inside California's prison system since 1981. He was already serving a life sentence when this federal case began. He will die in prison. The prosecutor's statement at sentencing reflected a truth that every chapter of this documentary has confirmed. Acting ATF Director Daniel Driscoll stated that the walls of a prison do not shield violent gang leaders from justice. He was right. But those same walls had also not shielded the streets of Los Angeles County from Stinson, Clement, and Johnson. 7 people were dead. The brand had been inside California's prisons since 1964. And in 2025, it was still operating. Still using smuggled cell phones. Still ordering murders. Still collecting its cut from drug sales flowing in and out of the facilities. The indictment that produced Stinson's conviction charged 11 defendants in total. As of the research date for this documentary, 5 remain awaiting trial. The case is not closed. That was the story of John Stinson and the Aryan Brotherhood. But while the brand consolidated its hold on the white inmate population of California's prisons, a different organization had been building its own infrastructure. An organization born not in a prison yard but in the hardcore punk scene of Long Beach, California in the 1980s. An organization whose co-founder climbed from the streets of Orange County all the way to a full membership card in the Aryan Brotherhood itself. An organization that, when California prison officials tried to destroy it, simply rebuilt under a different name. An organization that placed law enforcement officers on a verified hit list. His name was Donald Mazza. They called him Popeye. And federal prosecutors described him as a notorious Orange County gangster with personal knowledge of dozens of murders. Donald Reed Mazza co-founded Public Enemy No. 1, known internally as Pen 1, in Long Beach, California in the 1980s. The gang's earliest identity was rooted in the hardcore punk scene flourishing in Southern California at that time. A subculture of young white men who were angry, alienated, and attracted to music that expressed both. But the punk scene was only the incubator. What grew inside it was something else entirely. By the late 1980s, Pen 1's base of operations had shifted from Long Beach to Orange County. And the organization had shifted with it, from a loose punk affiliation to a criminal gang with white supremacist ideology, methamphetamine as its primary commodity, and an increasingly deep relationship with California's prison system. Maza himself was a heavy heroin user. According to the Anti-Defamation League's documented profile of Pen 1, it was the drug habits of Maza and other early members that drove the gang's evolution from ideology into criminal enterprise. They needed money to support their habits. And the fastest route to money in the ecosystem they inhabited was to sell drugs. So they sold drugs. And as Pen 1 grew, geographically and institutionally, Maza steered it into an increasingly structured relationship with the prison network, using incarcerated members as recruiters and using the prison hierarchy to extend the gang's authority beyond Orange County into cities across Southern California. In April 1999, Maza was released from prison. He had been out for approximately 10 hours. According to prosecutors, within those 10 hours, he stabbed a fellow gang member named William Austin. Austin was believed to be cooperating with law enforcement. A second Pen 1 leader held Austin down while Maza attacked him. Austin survived. He later testified against Maza. In 2003, Maza was convicted of attempted murder for that attack. He was sentenced to 15 years at Pelican Bay State Prison, one of California's most restrictive facilities, housing validated gang members in near total isolation in its security housing unit. It was at Pelican Bay in 2009 that Maza took the step that would define the final chapter of his criminal career. He became a full member of the Aryan Brotherhood. The significance of that transition was not symbolic. It was structural. Full AB membership gave Maza access to a criminal network whose authority extended far beyond Pen 1's reach. And it gave Pen 1, through Maza's status as a made AB member, a level of credibility and protection inside the California prison system that the gang had never previously possessed. By 2017, the Anti-Defamation League described Maza as Pen 1's most notable leader, a man who used his Aryan Brotherhood status to bolster Pen 1's credibility and influence throughout the state prison system. But that same year, federal investigators were building the case that would end his freedom permanently. In 2019, Maza was indicted alongside 15 other alleged members and associates of the Aryan Brotherhood in a sweeping federal racketeering case. Prosecutors charged that an alleged Aryan Brotherhood commissioner named Ronald Dean Yandel had ordered Maza to murder a fellow gang member named Michael Thumper Tripp. According to the indictment, Tripp had run afoul of the organization's internal rules. The order was delivered through a contraband cell phone. The same method Stinson and his co-defendants had used. The same method governing criminal communication inside California's prison system for more than a decade. What Maza's own plea agreement documents next is worth understanding precisely. Maza did not want to kill Tripp. They were friends. But the plea agreement states explicitly, entered into the permanent federal record, that Maza understood if he did not carry out the order, he would eventually be targeted by the enterprise for murder, because he had not fulfilled his responsibility as a member. That sentence, signed by Maza and filed in federal court, describes the fundamental reality of life inside any organization built on the principles of the Aryan Brotherhood or the Mexican Mafia or any of the other 6 gangs documented in this film. Membership is not a choice you can unmake. The order came. Maza agreed to carry it out. Tripp was never killed. A third co-conspirator, a former MMA fighter and Pen 1 member named Matthew Psycho Hall, was also involved in the plot. Hall was arrested in Costa Rica in August 2019 on separate charges. He died by suicide after his arrest. He was never tried. In June 2022, Donald Maza pleaded guilty in federal court to conspiracy to murder Tripp and to a general racketeering charge acknowledging his full membership in the Aryan Brotherhood prison gang. He was 51 years old. He had co-founded Pen 1 in the 1980s. He had become a made member of the Aryan Brotherhood in 2009. He had spent the intervening decades building an organization that the California Department of Justice described in 2004 as one of the most powerful and fastest-growing gangs inside and outside prison in the state. In 2007, before his second major federal prosecution, law enforcement agencies across Orange County discovered something that went beyond drug trafficking and identity theft. They discovered a list. Pen 1 had compiled a hit list of targets. On that list were 5 police officers and a gang prosecutor. The list was not theoretical. It was operational. Donald Maza's current custodial status has not been confirmed in available public federal records as of the research date for this documentary. What is confirmed is that the organization he built is still operational. Pen 1 members are still being prosecuted. Their symbols are still being tattooed in California's jails and prisons. And the alliance between Pen 1 and the Aryan Brotherhood, the alliance Maza himself embodied, is still being documented by law enforcement intelligence units across Southern California. Now here is what most crime coverage will never tell you. Every person documented in this film, Jose Landa-Rodriguez, Michael Lerma, Stanley Tookie Williams, George Jackson, John Stinson, Donald Maza, operated on the same fundamental principle. The principle is this: incarceration does not neutralize power. It concentrates it. When law enforcement removes a gang leader from the street and places him inside a controlled facility, they do not remove his capacity to direct violence, to tax criminal economies, or to enforce organizational discipline. They simply change the medium through which that authority flows. Landa-Rodriguez used attorney-client meetings, routing orders through legal visits that could not be recorded by law enforcement. Lerma used a chain of senoras and secretaries on the streets of Pomona who collected taxes and managed enforcement in his name.